So there's been a lot of press recently about how Laravel and React or Vue or Svelte, they don't clash. It's not us versus them. Laravel and React, Vue or Svelte, they all work together. Whether you're using something like Inertia, or we're going to take a look at what Laravel looks like strictly as a backend, as an API for something like Next.js. So Laravel's starter kits, which includes Breeze and Jetstream. Breeze has a Blade version, a Livewire version, a React and Vue version, which is Inertia, the glue holding those React or Vue layers with your backend in one mono repo. And then a Breeze and Next.js with an API version of Laravel. This is one that doesn't get talked about that much, and frankly, it's very underrated because you get the power of Next.js, the power of using all of those components, just like you might with Inertia, but you can host it anywhere and then use Laravel on the back end and still have the same magic, the same functionality that you're accustomed to within a Laravel application. So why don't we take a look at what this looks like? For example, you get to scaffold out a Laravel application, which basically just gives you the ability to have it set as a full back-end API. And then the Laravel team has a Next.js reference implementation available on GitHub. So why don't we take a look at what these two folders look like together, how to set them up, and then some magic that they combine. All right, I created a new directory on my local machine where this project is going to live, and I called it Lara Next. So why don't we go into that directory, and now we're going to start by installing the Laravel Backend API. We can do that with the Laravel installer. That's Laravel new, and then we can just pass it the name of the directory where this Laravel application is going to live. And since I have Laravel herd set up, I have access to this Laravel new command in my command line. Laravel new, we're just going to call this API. We're going to start off with a starter kit because, as we saw earlier, Laravel Breeze has a starter kit, where if we were to scroll all the way down, we have API only. The other next ones don't really matter too much, just for our testing purposes right now. And while this installs, why don't you take a sip of water and we'll get going. We'll use SQLite, and then we'll be off to the races. This is mostly just for simplicity's sake, so that way we have a database all set up and ready. We'll go ahead and pull some information from the database so that we can display it in our Next.js application. And we're actually going to run a command from our Next.js application and start off a queue in our database. And all of that queue driver and everything will live in our SQLite database collection. So we'll go ahead and run those migrations just so we're all set up and ready, because we do need migrations set up for our user table. Because like we saw in the starter kit, not only does Laravel Breeze in this Next.js application make talking to your backend a lot easier because it has a hook set up out of the box for us, but it has users all set up as well. So let's go ahead and install now so we can see that we have our API directory. Let's go ahead and install the Next.js application as well. So we're going to go into GitHub, and we're going to grab the GitHub repo from Laravel, which is the Breeze Next.js implementation. I have the GitHub CLI, so that's just going to be GitHub repo clone Laravel/breeze-next. I'm going to place this into the client folder. And after that's already cloned, I'm going to go into the client folder. I'm going to make sure I'm using the most recent version of Node, and we're just going to say npm install, not that, npm install. There we go. Perfect. Okay, now why don't we open this up in our code folder? Okay, so in our code folder, you can see here in the README that it gives us some instructions for how we can start implementing this from within our Laravel application. Since we already have an API set up, that isn't running just yet, so we can't necessarily have that connection just yet. But why don't we see what we have to do? So we created the Laravel application. We already did that. We installed Laravel Breeze because we started with the starter kit, and we ran the migrations. So it says next, ensure your application's app URL and front-end URL environment variables are set to localhost 8000, localhost 3000 respectively. So why don't we go back into our command line? What we're going to do is go to our, let's actually open this into a new tab, and we'll go into our API folder, and we'll just go ahead and run PHP artisan serve. Now it looks like this was going to be serving on port 8000, which is perfect for us. And now we need to copy over the env.example file in this Next.js directory and change it to .env.local. Now we can just go ahead and do that right here. So I'm just going to say this is .env.local. There we go. And then we should be all set up and ready to go. All right. And let's go ahead and run npm run dev. Perfect. Looks like we're all ready to go. Now, if we were to access this in our local site, what we see here is the Breeze implementation within Next.js. Now, why don't we go ahead and check out what these login and register routes actually do. So we have register, and looks like we can actually register ourselves a user. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Perfect. And we're all logged in. So we have the ability to have users that can log in. And now these users are then stored to our database in Laravel. So one of the first things that I like to do is take a look at what the implementation looks like within this Next.js directory. So that way we know how it's already been done within this project, within this scaffolded starter kit, if you will. And then what are some of the conventions that have already been placed here that we can build upon? So let's go back into our code editor and we'll go ahead and take a look at some of the files. So we have a source directory. This is using the app directory within Next.js. And then we have our auth pages. We don't really need to touch those right now. We can definitely look at those for implementation advice and experience. We have the app directory, which has a layout directory, a loading directory, navigation, as well as a header.js. And then we have the library, which has an Axios implementation. This is going to be key because we're going to be using this for all of our post and fetch requests because we're grabbing information from the base URL and we're going to be passing XSRF tokens through this Axios.create call. And then we have this hooks file, which is giving us the implementation for auth.js. This is what makes it easy to kind of in our page here, be able to see information from the user. So if we wanted to, let's go ahead and go to our dashboard. And why don't we show maybe the email that we signed up with on the dashboard? Let's see how hard this might be to implement. So if we were to go into app, we have dashboard, and then we have page.js. You can see here that we don't have access to a user here. So how would we implement this? Well, if we were to take a look at that auth.js file, you can see here that we have access to this user, API/user. Now this is a hook using the useAuth hook to get the user from the API, verify their email, and then grab that information. So how is this being done in the navigation? Why don't we check? So in that navigation, this is where we kind of see that name up here in the top. So how are we accessing that name? Again, we saw the use auth hook that we have access to within the library, but within here, we're having this children prop of user. Now, where are we actually using this down here? It looks like we have a, let's see, it looks like we have a dashboard and maybe it's right over here. Let's see. Oh, there we go. User.name. So we should have access to the email as well. Let's just say if we have a user.email and this were to change, we have access to that email there. So how would we pass in this into our actual dashboard page? Well, if we were to take a look at the layout that Laravel has set up within this Next.js implementation, again, this is all just using the implementation that the Laravel team maintains to get you up and running, connected to your Laravel database, Laravel application, all the tools and magic and functionality that you get within a Laravel application, but now you just have this Next.js implementation on the front end. Okay, so in the layout, we're passing in this useAuth middleware, and this is that useAuth hook that we have available to us through this Next.js implementation. Again, just to note, this has to be done in a client component. So how would we implement this to display on the page in the dashboard? Well, the dashboard isn't a client component, so let's go ahead and create a component. Let's just say this is our maybe our user display or user HUD, for example. And maybe we'll go ahead and do that in components, and we'll just go ahead and say that this is, let's say, new file. And we'll just go user component.js. And we'll go ahead and we'll just say that this is a use client page, and we'll go ahead and import auth. Then we'll just say this is user component, and we'll just say, we'll display, we don't need this image here, but we'll go ahead and display the user's name and maybe we'll just go ahead and say maybe their email as well. Okay. We don't actually need to pass in any children props. We're just going to display this user component. So what we should be doing is export default user component, and then we should be able to use this component in our file, in our dashboard.page file. So let's go ahead and import the user component from @components, user component, and then we'll say you're logged in. Instead, we'll just call this the user component. Now let's see what this does. For example, now we have our name and our email. If we were to refresh this, you can see here that it's loading as the user is loading the information on the page. Just note that this is one of many different ways that you could actually pull information from your Laravel application. Now we are just using the hook that the Laravel team has provided in this Next.js implementation. It does make things a little bit easier because it's all set up for you. But if you want to use something like React Query or fill in the blank with your favorite kind of implementation to talk to the server when it comes to actually grabbing that information, you can do that. This is just something that's been set up for you, and this is what we'll continue to use as we kind of pull information from the server. So there we go. We have our user and we have our username. And again, that's just a component that is being loaded in onto our dashboard page.js. It's just a component that we created using that useAuth hook that we have access to in any client component across our whole Next.js application because of this auth.js hook file that has been set up for us when we scaffolded out this application. So let's take a look at what this is actually doing. It's using use SWR. That is a React hook for data fetching that the Vercel team put together. And it's an HTTP cache invalidation strategy that basically just after first returning the data from the cache, it sends the fetch request to revalidate that information. And then it finally comes with the up-to-date data. And we're doing that through Axios right here. And that's where we have that Axios library to pull information using the credentials that we've already passed. And because we have that use auth hook, we can pass in the information from the user to our Laravel application to know if this user is actually authenticated, if they're able to use and validate that information. So how would we use the structure that's already been given with things like this Axios library component to actually grab information from our Laravel API? Well, in this case, we could use that use SWR hook, and we are just kind of using the auth hook to kind of give us this implementation where we're just grabbing data, passing it to a variable, or destructuring that data, I should say, and grabbing the specific API endpoint that we want to display that information from or grab that information from. So this display fruit is just a component that we have that just grabs the fruit from the API and then displays. And for now, we're just going to stringify that data just to see what we have. But let's go ahead and write this route in our Laravel application. So we can say route get, and we'll just go ahead and call this slash fruits. And maybe we'll go ahead and return fruit all. That should work great. So let's go ahead and see what that does. And maybe we can even pass on middleware of auth sanctum. And this is just saying that, we'll go ahead and bring that in. This is just saying that this has to be an authenticated user to go ahead and make this API request. So we have API slash API slash fruits. So that looks like it's routing to their proper name. So why don't we take a look? And so in our application, we're not actually going to see anything displayed because we don't have any data. So why don't we input some data? Let's go ahead, some fruits. We have a name quantity field. So let's go ahead and call this watermelon. And we'll say we have 30 of those. And we'll say some peaches. And we have 10 of those. And then maybe some strawberries, and we have 3 of those. Okay. Okay, and it looks like we're grabbing information about our user. So what did we do wrong? Let's go ahead and take a look. Aha, we have slash API slash user where actually we want fruits. Let's take a look now. So now we have this information available to us. It's information that we added to the database. So why don't we clean this up a little bit just to make this look a little prettier. There we go. So we have watermelon, we have peaches, and we have, oh, let's go ahead and change that. So we have strawberries. Aha, perfect. Now, what if we wanted to only make this available to the user? Because we're using Laravel on the Backend API, this just makes that so much easier because now we can say, I only want to grab the fruits that are associated with the user. So why don't we make that change on the Laravel backend and then see how easy it is to implement in the Next.js implementation. So first, I'm actually just going to roll back that migration so that we don't have any more fruits. All right, now in our fruits table, why don't we go ahead and give this a foreign ID for our user ID, and we'll just say that that's constrained to that specific user. And now in our fruit model, we'll say that if fruit has to be associated with a user, belongs to a user, perfect. And then we'll go ahead and say a user has many fruits. So why don't we add that down here? So public function fruits has many, perfect. Now, why don't we implement this in our API so we're only grabbing fruits that are associated to this user. So return fruit all. Now we can pass in the request here, and we can say return fruit all or return request user fruits. That way we're only returning the fruits that are associated with this user. So why don't we go ahead and add some more fruits? There should be none right now. And it looks like we need to first migrate those. So let's go ahead and PHP artisan migrate. There we go. Now we have some fruits. Let's take a look. Now, why don't we go ahead and they're not going to be associated with a user. Let's actually create a new user. We'll go ahead and duplicate. We'll say this is a Taylor, and we'll go ahead and say taylortest.com and a password of password. Okay, so now we have two users. So these fruits I'm going to add to the second user, and we'll just say this is strawberries, and we'll have 3. And then my user, will have watermelon, and we'll have 8. And then the third thing will be peaches, and there'll be one of those. So user 2 Taylor has 2 fruits, and user 1 only has 1 fruit. So what should we see in our browser? Just watermelon. Now, this is how easy it is to connect to our Laravel implementation. We didn't change anything in our Next.js code here. We're still querying the same data, but because we have already authenticated, because we're using the hook that we have here, because we're using the Axios library, which includes any credentials that are already set because we're logged in, we have access to that in our request to request the user's fruits. Okay, but what if we wanted to take this one step further? What if we wanted to actually run some information or collect some data and put it into a queue on our Laravel API backend and then just display that information or have the user kickstart this process from our Next.js frontend? So instead of using use SWR, which is just for grabbing information, we can still use the Axios Axios library that the Laravel team has put together through this libaxios.js. But if we take a look at the hooks auth, we can see here some implementation for posting. You can see here that we have this await CSRF. That's to grab the actual sanctum cookie for our authentication and then post it to a particular API endpoint. Now, in this case, this is to posting to /register. But if we to go into our send fruit roundup, which is one that I created, we're basically grabbing that sanctum cookie. But then when this button is clicked, we have this handle click button. When this button is clicked, we're going to grab that data. That's sending the cookie off, waiting for that, and then posting to this send fruit email API endpoint on our Laravel application, which maybe we'll send an email to the user with their fruits that they have in the backend. Maybe we'll queue up that email so that it doesn't overload our server when this button is pressed. And then we'll just send a response back to the client saying this message was queued or this message was sent. Here we have that response message being displayed out on our Next.js client. So why don't we go ahead and write this endpoint? So we'll go ahead and route post. We'll say that this is slash, what do we call it? Send fruit email. Perfect. So we'll go ahead and pass in a function. And because we need the actual authenticated user, we'll go ahead and grab that request. Okay, perfect. And we'll just grab the fruits from the user first so we can pass that into our email. I actually set up an email all ready to go. This is just basic Laravel email mailables where we'll take that information and pass it on to a simple blade view. So we grab the user's fruits, and then let's go ahead and do a mail to, and we'll go ahead and send this to the request user's email. And instead of sending a fruit email, why don't we go ahead and queue it? So this is just simply saying, instead of sending it directly in this server request, let's go ahead and queue it up. And then why don't we return a response? And we'll say that this is a JSON message, and we'll say fruit email queued up. There we go. And let's round this off. Perfect. So let's bring in the necessary facades. We have the fruit mail that I set up for us. And then let's go ahead and start up our queue. So we'll go PHP artisan queue work. We have that ready to go. And why don't we take a look at what this looks like on our front end? Perfect. So we have the fruits that are being displayed, but what if we want to send that roundup email? Click this button, fruit email queued up. We get that response back immediately from the server. If we were to take a look at our queue, we see that that was running and then completed. Now let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like in our email. And bam, there we go. We have a simple fruit email with the actual fruits that we have from our database linked to our user. Overall, there's so much more that we could show for how to use a front-end implementation like Next.js with Laravel strictly as an API. But this implementation through this Next.js Breeze, straight from the Laravel team, gives us a great starting point to have those resources, those libraries, those best practices already set up for us for how to retrieve information and how to send it. And of course, if you're familiar with Next.js, you might have the tools that you already need in order to retrieve information and to send it. But this just gives you a great starting point. If anything, a great repo to kind of look to and learn from as you're building this out yourself. Overall, you shouldn't have to choose if you want to use Next.js or Laravel. There might be a great opportunity to use both. Take advantage of things like queues and emails and background jobs within Laravel, but have all of your front end being served up with Next.js. Or maybe you have additional external APIs that just work easier if you're hitting them and serving them up through your Next.js front end. And while the glued together might not be as simple as something like inertia, you still have the ability to have those powerful front end combined with the powerful back end within Laravel without having to compromise on any flexibility altogether. So Laravel and Next.js can be used together.